And so for those of you who might be a bit newer here this morning, the way that we tend to preach is we just take a book of the Bible and we start making our way through it chapter by chapter, verse by verse, sometimes even word by word. And so with that, we've been in the Gospel of Luke since about the beginning of September. And so it's been, for me at least, just a remarkable thing to be able to spend a sustained period of time diving deep into a portrait of Jesus Christ. The Old Testament, as you know, points to him. The book of Acts proclaims him. The bulk of the New Testament reflects on him. The book of Revelation declares him as victor. The Gospels are unique and significant because they reveal him. They give us him. They're pure, they're direct, they're a clear picture of his nature and his purpose and, of course, his work. And so with that, we finally come this morning to the end of chapter 2, the end of this great section here in the beginning of Luke's gospel. But the final portion here, which is verses 39 through 52, is without doubt the pinnacle and the very point of everything that Luke has been driving toward. This is the apex. This is the summit. This is the zenith, if you will, of the entire narrative and the passage then upon which the rest of the gospel is launched. And so with that, there's something incredibly foundational that we're going to see here this morning. Something absolutely essential for understanding how the rest of the gospel works, and of course, incredibly essential for understanding the nature of our own redemption. And so before we begin this morning and take a look at the passage, I'm going to read it for us, and then, Lord willing, walk through it. So that's Luke chapter 2. And we'll be in verses 39 through the end of the chapter. Luke writes these words. He says, "And when they had performed everything according to the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own city of Nazareth. And the child continued to grow and to become strong, increasing in wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. When he became 12, they went up there according to the custom of the feast, and as they were returning, after spending the full number of days, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. But his parents were unaware, but supposed him to be in the caravan and went a day's journey, and they began looking for him among their relatives and acquaintances. And when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem looking for him. And then after 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers, both listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. And when they saw him, they were astonished, and his mother said to him, 'Son, why have you treated us this way? Behold, your father and I have been anxiously looking for you.' And he said to them, 'Why is it that you were looking for me? Did you not know that I had to be, or that I must be, in my Father's house?' But they did not understand the statement which he had made to them. And so he went down with them and came to Nazareth, and he continued in subjection to them, and his mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus kept increasing in wisdom and stature, and in favor with both God and men." Well, as we've been working through these first two chapters, we've seen a lot of testimony. Seen a lot of testimony concerning the person of Christ himself. And so Luke, just being a good historian and desiring to accurately capture what took place, he's sure here to consult these witnesses and these testimonies surrounding these events concerning this child. And so to begin, we began with the testimony of the angel Gabriel when he showed up and made that announcement to Zacharias in the middle of the temple concerning the Messiah after about 400 years of complete silence. He shows up to Zacharias and announces all these things concerning the Christ, which must soon take place. We saw then the witness of Elizabeth and Zacharias, that old priestly couple, and we saw him just burst forth in these hymns of praise at the recognition of the true Messiah. We saw the testimony of Mary and Joseph. Last time we saw the witness of Anna and Simeon, and so this morning we're going to see the testimony of Jesus Christ himself. In fact, that's the entire point of this passage, the entire point of all that Luke's been driving toward for 2 entire chapters. In fact, the essence of the passage here is to give a historical account, and so it's a historical record of Jesus' own self-understanding of his divine identity. And not only his identity, but a self-understanding of his own purpose in mission as the incarnate Christ, as God made flesh. And so with that, this is also a record of Jesus' earliest words. In fact, this is the earliest that we see of him in all of the gospel records. And so while they all speak of his birth and then, of course, his ministry, which formally began at about age 30, and so there's just this massive gap between his birth and when his ministry begins in Galilee. We've got something incredibly unique here in the Gospel of Luke, and that it's the only account that says anything regarding the time between his birth and ministry. And yet, this is all that we have. This is the only thing that we have apart from his birth account and ministry, and so with that, it's the only historical record of anything that he spoke outside of his ministry. And so what's interesting about that is that his words here are contained in just one short verse. Just one line, just one brief flurry of rhetorical questions, and they actually establish the entire foundation of the rest of the gospel. And so not only do they create this launching point for the gospel, but the meaning of his words here contain the essence of that which would eventually get him killed, that which would anger a nation and incite riots and bring in his execution. And so he makes a very powerful proclamation at only the age of 12 here in the form of 2 short yet profoundly insightful questions. 2 questions which reveal everything regarding who he is and all that he's accomplished. This is incredibly foundational, immensely rich with meaning and purpose. And so with that, just notice how the narrative begins then, starting here in verse 39. Luke states these words. He says, "And when they had performed everything according to the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own city of Nazareth." So remember, if you're able from last time, that they went to Jerusalem here to fulfill something called the law of purification, which you can read about in Leviticus chapter 12. And so the law of purification was something that the Jews were required to perform, and especially if your firstborn child was a male. And so it's this process where you'd essentially go down to the temple in Jerusalem and offer a sacrifice, either a lamb, or if you were poor, as it says, 2 turtle doves, or 2 pigeons, which of course is the case of Mary and Joseph, being as poor as they were. And then you would dedicate your child, or your firstborn male here, as holy unto God. And so with that, they were extremely devout. These were faithful Jews, faithful to the law, faithful to fulfill all that God had required of them. And so as they did this, they in essence placed Jesus then under the fullness of Mosaic law. And so not only did they sacrifice, but verse 21, he was also circumcised and then offered up as holy. And so in this initial act here, which is what we saw last time, we see that Jesus comes under the fullness of the law. He was subject to the law. He was placed under the law, which of course is going to be significant as one who has to fulfill the law if he's to be a sufficient sacrifice. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that once we get to chapter 4, but suffice it to say that Mary and Joseph here, being these incredibly devout and righteous Jews, are careful to walk in accordance to everything that God has required. And so they head to Jerusalem, have him circumcised, offer their sacrifice, set him apart as holy unto God. And so in verse 39, they head back to Nazareth, where we essentially have the passage of about 12 years. And so what becomes very interesting then, at least in terms of trying to understand the nature of Jesus, is what we begin to see here starting in verse 40. And it's very significant. In fact, vital portions of theology are built off this verse along with 52. And so notice what he states here starting in verse 40. He writes, "And the child continued to grow and to become strong, increasing in wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him." Now, this is extremely mysterious and at the same time essential for understanding the purpose for why Jesus came into the world. And so essentially what you have here is the doctrine of something known as the hypostatic union. There's a $5 word for you. the doctrine of the hypostatic union. Now, massive volumes have been written to try and figure this stuff out, and so I don't have anywhere near the time to even begin to touch the complexity of this, but suffice it to say that the hypostatic union is that Jesus Christ, the second person of the Trinity, the very Son of God himself, took on flesh and became 100% man. He became 100% man or 100% human, and yet at the same time remained 100% divine. He is, as the ancients would say, fully God and yet fully man. Or since math just seems to make it more confusing to our finite minds, he is truly God and truly man. Now, what's important to understand is that when the second person of the Trinity took on flesh, he relinquished nothing of his divinity. And so he gave up nothing of what it meant to be fully God in every sense of the term. He was still the second person of the Trinity. He was still holding all things together, as it says in Colossians 1, including the very molecules that made up his body and the ground upon which he would walk. And yet at the very same time, and this is the mystery of it, but at the same time as he took on flesh, he took on the fullness of what it means to be human in every sense of the term. In every sense of the term, he was completely subjected in every aspect to what it means to be a finite, for the first time, creation. Of what it means to be human, of what it means to be something created. Now again, this is reserved for a theology course that we can teach at some point, but what this doesn't mean is that when God, or in this case, the second person of the Trinity became a man, that he was just fully God, but wrapped in some flesh. He wasn't just the Spirit of God, who's actually the third person of the Trinity, just sort of inserted into a human body. He wasn't a divine entity that just somehow took over a human body. He wasn't even the mind of God just sort of put into an infant. But rather, he was, in every sense, fully man. Now, this is confusing. In fact, the longer that you think about it and the more that you try to make sense of it, probably the more confused you're going to get. And so just like every other major doctrine of the Christian faith, there is an enormous amount of mystery packed into this. In fact, there are many things that we just don't know, but the point to understand with all this is that the moment that you begin to emphasize one nature of Christ over the other, either his divine nature or his human nature, you're going to actually end up in some kind of problem. Or as church history tells us, some kind of heresy. And so while it might not seem like that big of a deal to you, it becomes immensely important because depending on what you understand Jesus to be and how some of this stuff works out, it has massive implications for what you understand Christ to have actually accomplished on the cross. And how it is that he becomes an acceptable sacrifice on behalf of man. And so for our purposes here this morning, it's important to understand that we affirm the classic position that Jesus Christ was fully human in every possible sense, and yet at the same time, fully God. Fully man, fully divine, and the details of that we're going to have to leave for another time. But Luke here, in the way that he's writing, as opposed to the way that John does it in his gospel, he's actually trying to bring out the human side or the humanity of Jesus Christ. He has a bottoms-up approach to Christology, which is a fancy term that means the study or theology of the nature and work of Jesus Christ. And so notice it says that in verse 40 that the child continued to grow, speaking of his physical nature, that like every other human, he grew, he became a boy, he then became a young man. In other words, everything about him was normal. In fact, that's the point. That's exactly what he's trying to emphasize here, at least in terms of his physical nature. He was human. He was truly a boy. He eventually became a man. He was conceived of the Holy Spirit, but the rest of the process in terms of his physical growth here was like that of every other person. And so notice, he grew and developed and learned to walk. He learned to talk. He experienced everything that every child has to experience, things like growing pains and puberty and hunger and thirst, and to learn to have self-control over his own physical body. In fact, it's the exact same phrase here that we see in chapter 1 and verse 80 with regard to John the Baptist, where it says that the child, talking there about John, continued to grow and to become strong in spirit. And so when it comes to the humanity of Jesus, what we have to understand is that there is nothing special. He was like every other human. He grew, he developed, he was nourished, he became strong. And so the point to understand is that he was made in every aspect like us. And that's the point. He was made to be like us. He took on everything that is us, that which is flesh, that which is human. And so if you'll notice verse 40, there's this phrase which states that he was increasing in wisdom, and it's a phrase which grammatically modifies the preceding verb here, that he was one who became strong. And so in that sense, then, it functions to tell us how he became strong. And so the idea of him growing, the first verb here speaks of his physical nature, but this one, the becoming strong, speaks of his spiritual nature. In fact, the phrase here, plereumenon sophia, translated as increasing in wisdom, actually speaks to a certain kind of filling. It was a filling with wisdom, a filling with the unique mind of God himself. And so the way that he became strong then was by being in the consistent state of being filled or controlled with God's wisdom. That he possessed the very mind of God, that he lived his life even as a child in this day by day and moment by moment of experience of being consistently filled and controlled with God's wisdom. And so in that sense then, he was anything but normal. He had the wisdom of God and the mind of God. And why? Well, because he was God, and yet being fully human and fully flesh, the text states that he somehow grew in this, whatever that means. And so in one sense, he was very normal, and yet at the same time, incredibly complex. He was an incredibly complex being. Makes your brain hurt. And so Luke here, wanting to emphasize the humanity of Jesus, states both here and in verse 50 that Jesus was like every other person, that he grew both physically and spiritually, and yet somehow, in some way, possessing the very mind of God, because he was God, was in every sense controlled by divine wisdom. In fact, he was increasingly controlled by wisdom and walked in wisdom, and therefore grew in a knowledge and understanding that, quite frankly, nobody possessed. And yet at the same time, and this is the mystery of it, in his human capacity, it's clear from the text that he was in no way omniscient. That is to say that he didn't know everything. Now, perhaps he had the capacity for that, but he couldn't know everything. He couldn't tell you what the internet was. He didn't speak Mandarin. He couldn't tell you how many stars were in the sky, even though in some mysterious and even wonderfully complex way, and we know this from Colossians chapter 1, he was still the very one holding them in their place. And so he wasn't omniscient in the sense that in his human nature he could know all things, and so he had to grow in this knowledge, as the text says. And yet as he grew in this, it was a knowledge that was informed and controlled by divine wisdom. By divine wisdom. And so as his brain grew in its sort of physical development, he became capable then of receiving more and more understanding and wisdom of God, so that when he was 12, as we're going to see here soon, he somehow got it. He got it. He understood it. He knew who he was. He knew who God was. He knew why he had come. He was now capable of perfectly thinking God's thoughts after him, and so he knew exactly what those thoughts were. He knew what wisdom was. He knew what was in man. In fact, as it states in John chapter 2 and verse 24, but Jesus on his part was not entrusting himself to man. Why? For he knew all men. And because he did not need anyone to testify concerning man. Why? For he himself knew what was in man. How do you know what's in man unless you're God? Unless you possess the mind of God and the very wisdom of God. And so Luke here states that he grew and became strong. How? Well, by being full of wisdom, and yet in all that, end of verse 40, and the grace of God was upon him. The grace of God was upon him. He had God's favor. He was with him. He cared for him. In fact, it's a statement of how this knowledge and wisdom came to him. He was special. He was unique. And so he was just an extraordinary person. His nature and existence were, quite frankly, incomprehensible He was the fullness of God himself and yet fully human. And so the text states that he needed to grow. He grew physically, mentally, spiritually. He possessed the mind and the wisdom of God. And so by the age of 12, he knew all that he needed to know. And yet, as Hebrews 4:12 states, yet all of this and without sin. Without sin. He was God. He was perfect. He was that spotless Son of Man. And so in both verse 40 and in 52, he creates these bookends to essentially summarize about 30 years of his life. And so he's emphasizing here the humanity of Jesus, that he was very much human. And so in this 30-year period then, in verses 41 through 51, he narrows in on a very specific event. And again, it's the only event that we have at this time, but he narrows in on one event, and it's to capture the essence of who he is, of who he was, of his identity and his divine mission. And so just notice how this event begins here, starting in verse 41. And he fast forwards about 12 years, and it's a very straightforward account. And so he says these words. He states, "Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover." Now, if you know anything about Jewish custom, you know that every year there were essentially three great feasts that every Jew would want to attend, and you can read about those in Exodus and Deuteronomy. You had Pentecost, you had Passover, and you had the Feast of the Tabernacles. And so these were three great festivals that every Jew would attend, or at least want to attend. Now, the reality of the times is that it was rather impossible for most Jews to attend every festival, just given the distance and difficulty of travel. But the one festival that you'd be certain to attend, if you could only make one, was the Feast of the Passover. And so the Passover was this great celebration of the nation of Israel. It was a celebration where they remember that passing over of the angel of death, if you remember, while they were enslaved in Egypt. And so they celebrated this great deliverance and this great passing over, if you will, of the angel. And so the Passover itself was actually only a one-day feast, or a festival, if you will, but attached to that then was something known as the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and this was a 7-day festival. And so that was to commemorate the actual coming out of Egypt, where God had delivered them from their bondage. And so you might remember the idea then of unleavened bread was actually to signify the haste and the speed with which God delivered them, that there wasn't even enough time for the yeast in the bread to rise. That's how quickly he brought salvation. And so every year they'd commemorate that deliverance and his faithfulness to that by spending 7 days of eating unleavened bread. And so the entire event was actually an 8-day feast. You had 1 day for Passover and 7 days of the unleavened bread. And so this was a great time of remembrance as the nation would reflect on God as Savior. He delivered them, he passed over them, he spared their children. And so the nation was commanded to remember this, not much different than our command to remember the Lord's Supper and the saving realities associated with his blood. And it's no wonder then why he instituted the Lord's Supper during the week of Passover. Now, what's interesting about these festivals, if you go back and read about them in Exodus and Deuteronomy, is that it was really only commanded and even necessary for the men to attend. And so while women and children weren't required by law to attend, as you begin to read later Jewish writings and the great teachers of the faith, and especially the prominent ones, and particularly a one named Hillel, who was the school of thought from which Paul the Apostle came, they actually began to teach that it was good and even right for the women and children to attend. Now, they didn't teach it as law, they didn't teach it as command, but they thought that it was good practice just to help maintain Jewish identity and pass along the heritage to the rising generations. And so as time went on, you were always able to recognize those families which were devout. Not only did they attend all the festivals, but all the women and children would attend. And so that's exactly what we see here then with Joseph and Mary. They were devout, they were righteous, they were eager to maintain Jewish heritage and to make certain that Jesus, their son, and even their other children, who they most certainly had at this point, were steeped in very early on in the Jewish customs. In other words, these were people of true worship. These were people who loved their God and worshiped him as a great deliverer. And so Mary and Joseph and Jesus and presumably their other children, even though they're not mentioned at this point, all make their way to Jerusalem for the great feast of this Jewish Passover. And so in verse 42, notice it says that they spent the full number of days. Again, just a reference to their incredible devotion. In fact, it was typical just to spend a day or two. Rarely would people spend the entire week, not to mention bring their whole family, women and children included. And yet the text states that the whole family comes and that they stay for an entire week. This is devotion. This is dedication. And so after attending the entire week, as Luke records, they then make their way back to Nazareth, and we see them here at the end of verse 43. It says that the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem and that his parents were unaware. Now, how are they unaware? I mean, how do you lose your child? How do you forget your son? How do you accidentally lose sight of the Son of God? Well, verse 44, they supposed that he was in the caravan. Now, they did like most parents do and simply assumed that the other one was watching. Not to mention at this point, he's 12 years old, and so basically a man in this culture, and so he doesn't actually need to be watched. They can just assume, being perfectly obedient his entire life, that he knew exactly what he was supposed to do. I mean, can you imagine? Can you imagine having a perfect child who always does what they're supposed to do and when they're supposed to do it and how they're supposed to do it, and with a perfect heart and perfect contentment and perfectly joyful? No wonder they got used to supposing. And so in order to make sense of this, you have to understand as well this idea of a caravan. Basically, you'd have a family or perhaps a village in this case. Remember, Nazareth was pretty small, and so they'd all travel, and so it'd be this time of fellowship and talking and caring for each other as they all made their way to Jerusalem. And so the way that a caravan would typically work is that it'd be this rather large entourage with all these men and women and children and animals. And so typically you'd have the women and the children in the front, because children, as you know, have this incredible ability to just kind of wander and lag behind, and so you can't be having the men and the animals set the pace. And so instead you'd have the children set the pace, and so this already would just drive me nuts, but this is what you had to do. And so if you were a woman, you'd typically be up front with all the other women and caring for the children and the infants, and the men would be in the back, sort of prodding from behind. Not to mention that this was a day of things like highway robbers and thieves, and so the men then would be in the back and be able to protect the rear of the entourage. And so this is what was going on in verse 40. They were traveling in a caravan, and it was about 80 miles one way, because remember, in order to get to Jerusalem, you always had to go around Samaria because of the Jewish perspective on the Samaritans. They didn't like each other. And so it'd be about 20 miles a day, and that makes it to be about a 4-day journey. And so they're in this caravan, Mary in front, Joseph in back, and both assuming that Jesus is with the other. Now, Jesus at this point was 12 years old, and we know that from verse 12. And so Joseph could have easily assumed that he'd be up front with Mary and the children. And yet, at the same time, because he is 12 and about to be a man, because remember, you're a man by the age of 13 in Jewish culture and basically ready to be married, she could have easily assumed that he was now with Joseph and the men. And so as verse 44 states, like all good parents, they each supposed that he was with the other, somewhere in the caravan. And so in verse 44, we see they get to the end of the day, and so they begin to set up camp and realize that Jesus is nowhere to be found. And so you could just imagine the conversation between these two. And so they head back to Jerusalem, verse 45, and then 46. After 3 days, they find him sitting in the temple. So 1 day out, 1 day in, and then 1 day to search for him. So a total of 3 days. And so you can just imagine here the frustration and the worry and the tension that you just lost the very Son of God. Like you had one job: feed him and keep him clothed. So they find him sitting in the temple, and the text says that he's not only sitting in the temple, but notice verse 45, he's sitting in the midst of the teachers. Now remember that this is Passover. This is one of the greatest events in the entire Jewish world. And so you would have had all of Israel, and it's pretty much over at this point, but you got all these great men and leaders and teachers and scribes and Pharisees, and they all just sort of ascend into the city. And so no doubt they're going to be sticking around here for a few days. And so you have here not just the great teachers of Jerusalem, but all the great teachers of the entire nation. And so what you have here are the best of the best. These are the elites. These are the greats. These are the influencers of the nation. And so here you have, in the midst of who would have been considered these great men and thinkers and leaders of the nation, this 12-year-old boy, this unknown, this child from some fringe village called Nazareth, this young teenager. And so notice, he's not merely listening to him here as they talk and discuss what would have been, no doubt, some high-level and technical conversation regarding matters of law and national affair and all sorts of theology. Really, in this culture, no place for a 12-year-old. But then notice, he's asking questions, like he's able to keep up. And not only is he able to keep up, and notice, verse 47, and all who heard him were amazed. Well, amazed at what? Well, amazed at his understanding and his answers. And so this would have been just a mind-blowing experience. In fact, the term here translated as amaze, existemi, is used to speak of a kind of wonderment and even a strange confusion that'll happen. In fact, it's used in chapter 8 of Luke to speak of the people's reaction immediately after Jesus raises that little girl from the dead. And so this is far more than just a simple wonderment. Rather, this speaks to a kind of confusion and perplexion that'll happen, and really only when God shows up and does something wonderful and there's a presence of his miraculous nature. In fact, Luke uses it all throughout the book of Acts to explain the reaction of people every time God shows up. You see it, for instance, in Acts chapter 2 and verse 7 at Pentecost, in that great outpouring of the Holy Spirit, and people are amazed when people start to speak in tongues and languages that they didn't even know. You see it in chapter 8 with Simon the sorcerer when he becomes amazed or astounded, as it says, at the signs and the deeds that were happening at the hands of the apostles. It speaks of the reaction of the people when the scales fall off the eyes of Saul, who's now Paul in chapter 9, and then he immediately begins to preach Jesus as the Christ, the very Messiah of Yahweh. And this is amazing to them because Paul was the one killing Christians. And why? For declaring Jesus as Lord. And so he goes from getting legal permission to cuff and then execute these Christians who profess Jesus as Lord to now declaring him as Lord. This is amazing. And so you see the term being used over and over by Luke to speak of these incredible realities that are associated with God and always incite confusion, incite wonder, incite mysterious perplexion. This is anything but normal. And so that's the exact reaction of the people here in verse 47. This was far more than just, this kid's pretty intelligent. This was a level of knowledge and dialogue that would have seemed to the people to be essentially supernatural. That there is just no way that these kinds of words and insights ought to be coming out of the mouth of a 12-year-old. This would have been a phenomenal scene. This would have been perplexing. This would have started people thinking that there is something far more than just a high IQ going on. There's something remarkable, something supernatural about this child and the things that he understands. In fact, this term here that Luke uses for understanding or insight speaks to a kind of penetration of the heart. In other words, he was speaking here in such a way that whatever he said would actually get past all that abstract and objective dialogue about the Old Testament and the law and all those kind of speculative scholarly discussions that were so typical of the Pharisees and the high teachers of the law. And instead, he has this ability to take all that he understood and penetrate the heart. It was something sober, something profound. Something that was deeply piercing about the way that he spoke when talking on matters of his God. And so this would have been a phenomenal scene. A phenomenal scene to see the wisdom of this child confound the so-called experts of wisdom. And so what's interesting is that notice in verse 48, his parents come in, and so he's actually in the middle of this discussion, in the middle of this exchange with these political and religious elite, these teachers of teachers, and so the text says that they're astonished. They're astonished at their discovery of him, and so notice it says, and when they saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us this way?" Behold, your father and I have been anxiously looking for you. And so they just completely miss it. They miss it. They're clueless. They're completely naive to the significance of what's before their eyes. In fact, the term here for astonished is a completely different term than the one used for amazement there in verse 46. Rather, this speaks to the fact that they're struck and then sort of relieved by the fact that they've just found him. And so this is actually a tone here of one who's essentially indignant. They're frustrated. They're upset. They're using the language here, notice, of one who's been wronged. Like there's some kind of injustice committed. She states, how could you do this? Like, how could you treat us this way, with all of her classic parent guilt? And so notice he responds then with two questions. Two questions, and this is typical of Jesus, by the way. This is pretty standard for him. He has this habit all throughout the gospel of always answering questions with questions. And we'll see him constantly trip the people up and tie them in knots and push them right back onto their heels as he refuses to play into their game and their political words. And so he comes back at his parents with these two short and yet profound questions. Two questions, and they function here really just to make a singular point. And so he states these words, verse 49. He says, "And why is it that you were looking for me? Did you not know that I had to be, or that I must be, in my Father's house?" Now, we could probably spend an entire sermon on this verse, and I won't do that to you, but he begins here with a question that should actually seem somewhat odd to us, considering that he's just completely abandoned his parents, and notice, without any kind of sensitivity to the fact that they've just lost their child in a pretty large city. And so it's completely reasonable here that they're looking for him. But the point of the question is tied up with the second one here, and that is to get at the very heart of who they must remember that he is. In other words, the question implies that they should know what he's doing. They should know why he's here. They should know why he has just separated himself. In fact, in Greek here, it's really interesting. There's actually two ways that you can ask a question. And the first one has an implied answer of yes, and the second one, of course, has an implied answer of no, and it's very clear in the text. It's not an assumption. And so with that here, and did you not know that I must be in my Father's house, it's stated with an emphatic yes. That yes, you should know that I must be in my Father's house. And so what's interesting about the text here is that there's an immediate contrast that he makes. And so notice at the end of verse 48, Mary says, "And behold, your father and I have been anxiously looking for you." And then he just immediately turns around in verse 49 and says with this emphatic yes to the question, "And did you not know, or did you forget that I must be in my Father's house? My true Father's house." And so he states the question here, and what he's actually doing is making an immediate separation to no longer identify himself with these people, with these mere humans. In other words, this is a demonstrative statement here of his own self-understanding, of his own self-understanding of his true identity. And so a lot of people wonder of when it was that he actually came to realize that he was the Son of God. And the truth is, we don't actually know the answer to that question, but what we can say with confidence is that it was at least by the age of 12. And so you have here a very clear event in which Jesus is coming to grips with who he is. And so it actually marks this great moment where he makes this radical shift to now self-identify as the very Son of God. Notice the language of Father. In fact, the separation is so dramatic that it's not only the last time that we see Joseph here in the gospel, but it's actually the last time that Mary's referred to by Jesus himself as mother. Never again will Jesus refer to him as mother or even Mary. He only refers to her as woman. As woman, never again is she called mother, never is she called Mary. Rather, she's only referred to as woman. And so she just becomes this obscure figure who just sort of fades to the background. In fact, the only other time that she's even mentioned by name in this entire gospel is in chapter 24, the very last chapter where they're going to the tomb, and then Luke there, as the writer, identifies her as Mary, the mother of James. The mother of James, Jesus' half-brother, Mary's other son. She didn't even get the title of Mary, mother of Jesus. And why is that? Well, one, there's actually nothing divinely significant about Mary, despite the Roman Catholic teaching on her. But far more important is that he's creating this incredible separation so as to remind Mary and Joseph of who he is. Of who he is, that he's not a mere man, he's not a mere son of flesh. Rather, he is the eternally existent second person of the Trinity, the very Son of God himself. He is divine, he is Yahweh, he is the Son of the living God. And so it is just this profound statement of his own self-understanding of his own divine identity. But even more than that, it's also a statement that reveals his self-understanding of his own divine mission. His divine mission, notice he states that I must be in my Father's house. Now, if you're using the New American Standard, you'll notice that the term house is italicized, which means that it's not actually part of the original. And so quite literally, it's, and I must be in or among my Father, or in or about my Father. Now, the context here lends well, I think, to the idea of house being a pretty good interpretation, just given the fact that the entire thing is cast in light of Mary and Joseph looking for the location of Jesus. But the overwhelming point of the phrase is to make clear that he is to be about his Father's mission. And that's the point. He's to be about his Father and his mission. And so what's important about the phrase, then, is this language, notice, of must or necessary. He says, did you not know that I had to be, or that I must be, about my Father? Now, it's kind of a strange way to our ears to phrase something, but it's very intentional and has a freight load of meaning behind it. In fact, it's a very unique term that's almost always used to speak of things like prophecy and fulfillment of that which must take place, of that which is determined by divine necessity and therefore must be fulfilled. And so in light of that, one commentator states it this way. He says that from the age of 12, then, his entire life was controlled by the divine must, the divine necessity of that which must come about. And so the term itself is used 12 times throughout this gospel, and so 10 of those are in reference to Christ, and then 7 of those 10 are in reference to the very same event or reality. And so the point to understand is that from the age of 12, he's not only understanding exactly who he is, but also exactly why he's come, and why it was necessary that he come. And so just listen to some of these passages as I read them, and listen to this language of must or necessary, and see if you can pick up on the reason then for why he came. I think this helps fill out the idea behind the question of Jesus here in the temple. So Luke 9:22, he says, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed and raised on the third day. Now, that's just the entire gospel. That's the entire reason and mission for why he's come. Chapter 13 and verse 33, nevertheless, I must journey on today and tomorrow and the next day. Why? For it cannot be that a prophet would perish outside of Jerusalem. Translation, I'm going to be killed in not many days from now. I'm going to be killed, but it's necessary that I be killed according to prophecy, which is where? Well, in Jerusalem. And why Jerusalem? Well, because it's in Jerusalem where the prophets are always slaughtered. Just read the Old Testament. Chapter 17 and verse 25, Jesus speaking of the Son of Man, which is just an Old Testament reference to the Christ, and so he's speaking here of himself. But first he, that is the Son of Man, must suffer many things and be rejected by this generation. So again, this was necessary. This was prophecy. This was a divine mandate by the Father that the Christ must suffer. He must be rejected. He must be rejected by this very generation. And why? Well, so that the cross could happen. So that the cross could happen. His entire life was this unflinching trajectory toward the cross. Chapter 22 and verse 37, for I tell you that that which is written of me must be fulfilled in me. And then he quotes here the Old Testament from that great messianic passage of Isaiah 53, where it's prophesied that the Christ had to suffer. And so he says, and he was numbered, speaking of what the Christ must do, he was numbered with the transgressors or sinners. And why? For that which refers to me now has its fulfillment. What's he talking about? He's talking about the crucifixion. He's talking about the fact that he must be counted as a sinner as he takes on the fullness of sin of man. And why? So that he might be executed, but in their place. In their place. He was to be regarded as a transgressor. Chapter 24 and verse 7, and the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men. And for what purpose? Well, to be crucified and the third day rise. Again, an explicit reference to this one event, this one mission, this one purpose that was prophetically determined and that must be fulfilled. The Christ of God, the very Son of God himself, was on a mission. He was on a mission, but a mission here that apparently was a mission of death. A mission of crucifixion, a mission in which he had to take the just penalty deserving of sinners. And again, he knew this. And then chapter 24 and verse 44, Jesus speaking after the resurrection, these are my words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all things which are written about me in the law of Moses, in the prophets, and the Psalms, in other words, just the entirety of the whole Old Testament, must be fulfilled. This must be fulfilled. These things about me must have their fulfillment. These things were written. Well, what was written? Well, over and over again, the constant beat of the Old Testament scriptures is that the Christ must come, he must suffer, he must be killed, he must rise again. And so this was the mission. This is the divine necessity. This is the very thing for which Jesus, and already at the age of 12, fully knows that he must be about. He must be about these things. This was his unflinching trajectory. And so we see in verse 50 of chapter 2 that Mary and Joseph still had no idea what he was even talking about. They had no idea what his statement was supposed to mean, even though the question here is an implied answer of yes, just given all that Old Testament scripture that points to what must happen to the Messiah. And so in verse 51, it says that he then leaves in perfect subjection and perfect submission to just once again show his perfect obedience. He's God, but he has perfect subjection. He subjects himself to these humans. Shows the perfection of his life, the perfection of his ability to keep the law in every single sense so that he could be the perfect, spotless lamb who could truly take away the sins of the world. And so let me just say here, because there are so many ideas as to who Jesus was and why he came. These things are rampant right now on the television with Easter. So many ideas, but the one thing you have to understand if you're to have any hope of salvation is that Jesus Christ, the Son here of the living God, came into the world and took on flesh for one reason and one reason alone, and that is to be the bearer of your sin. To be the bearer of your sin. From eternity past, the Father has purposed that his only begotten Son would fulfill this mission, and this mission was a mission of sin forgiveness. And so there are some of you in this room who right now, and I know this, walk with tremendous guilt. You have a lifetime of sin, a lifetime of shame, a lifetime of burden. And the reason for that is because you, like every other person in this room, in this world, including me, are monumentally gifted at doing what we do best, which is sin. Last week you were taught from Genesis chapter 3 that when they ate of the fruit of the tree, that God cursed this world, and so in that moment, something tragic took place, did it not? Everything in creation shifted. Everything fell, everything was broken, everything was shattered. Right became wrong, wisdom became folly, sin became attractive. Holiness became vile. And so death entered this world. The scriptures are very clear that the wages or the payment or the penalty of sin is death, which is why everybody always dies. This is why the death rate is 100%. And why? Because God's judicial conviction of guilt is 100%. Every person born is utterly sinful. Every person is utterly corrupt. In fact, however bad that you think you are in this very moment, the reality is that you are still far worse than you even know. Only God knows what's in the heart of a man. Not even you know what's in your own heart. And so we are all experts at comparing ourselves to others, are we not? We are experts at this, and so we'll always be able to find somebody worse than we are, but until you understand the absolute perfection and holiness of an infinite God who demands spotless righteousness, you do not understand the gravity of your situation. You don't understand this. We can't fix this. We can't change this. We can't go back. We can't change God's mind about us. We can't clean ourselves up. We can't dust ourselves off. The only thing that you and I can do is put all of our hope in the fact that God determined in Genesis 3:15 to bring forth that seed of the woman, and for what purpose? So that he might fulfill the divine necessity to set all things right. To set all things right. And so listen, you and I are confronted with something ultimate this morning. You and I are confronted with the reality of guilt, the reality of sin, the reality of our own transgressions, the reality that we walk day in and day out down a path of selfish pursuits where we think little of God and so much of ourselves. And so the only question that you have to answer this morning is, what in the world do you do with this man, Jesus Christ? What do you do with him? He knew exactly who he was and why he had come. And so we're going to see this all throughout the gospel, is that his life and sacrifice on your behalf, no matter what you've done, who you are, what you thought, what secrets you have, that you'll never bring to light. But listen, God knows it, he sees it, and he hates it. God despises sin. But what you have to understand is that this is the very reason then for why he had to come. This is why he had to come. From the beginning, from Genesis 3:15, desiring to set all things right and purchase a people for himself, determined to send forth his son, as Galatians states, at the fullness of time, born of a woman, born under the law. He'd be that seed, and why? Well, so that he might redeem those who are guilty of that law. That's why he's come. That's why he's come. And as Paul goes on to state there, not only are you redeemed from the guilt of the law, but then you're actually made a very son of God yourself. This is ridiculous. He states that you receive this divine adoption to now become a very son or daughter of him. And this was the mission. This was the divine must, the divine necessity of God. That what does Romans state? That while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. That while we were in the state of sin, hostile, rejecting him, he condescended. He knew why he had to come. And so he was handed over. He was made to suffer. He was flogged, beaten, spit upon. He had his beard ripped from his face. He had a thorn of crowns smashed into his skull because they mocked him for being king of the Jews. He was crucified. He had a spear shoved up through his side. He was buried in a tomb. And then 3 days later, in the absolute pinnacle of everything that we're going to celebrate next week, he rose in victory. He rose in triumph and put to death the very wage of our own guilt and sin, which is the reality of death itself. And so with complete sufficiency, and you have to hear that term, with complete sufficiency, no matter who you are, what you've done, he becomes your salvation. He became our salvation. He's the divine Son who fulfills the divine mandate. In fact, this is what he meant on the cross when he said, "It is finished." That's exactly what he meant. Literally, it is in the state of having been fulfilled. And why he could say in chapter 9 and verse 10 of this gospel that he's come to seek and to save that which is lost. And there are so many lost people in this world. So many without hope, so many which perpetually feel the crushing presence and the weight of guilt, of their own sin. And so as he came, and we'll see it all throughout this gospel here, but as he came, all that he ever required of any person, because he fulfilled the mission, all he ever required was faith. Faith and faith alone, to have faith and trust in the promise that no religion, no good works, no fixing yourself up could ever accomplish, but all that he requires is that you cast yourself onto the very promise that in him and him alone is the fullness of your salvation. And that in him, no matter who you are, salvation is possible. It is possible. And the way that this salvation comes is by coming to an end of yourself and by casting all of your cares and burdens and sin and guilt on him. You cast it all on him and you lay it at the foot of his cross. And why? Why can we do this? For as Peter states in his first letter, because he cares for you. Because he cares for you. You are one of his special creations. You bear his image. And so, desiring to demonstrate his love, he determined this divine necessity to send forth his Son into the world. And so time is out, but this is the message of the gospel. This is why Jesus has come. This is what all of us have been called to this morning, to trust and believe by faith. And so next week, as we gather, Lord willing, to remember the resurrection, we'll see how all of this was not only made possible, but how it's been eternally secured in him alone.